Minimum Standards for Commercial Aeronautical Activities, Advisory Circular 150-5190-7. So, brief introduction. This advisory circular provides basic information pertaining to FAA recommendations on minimum standards for airport operating procedures. The FAA encourages the usage of this advisory circular. However, compliance is not mandatory. The following guidelines set forth and the minimum standards set forth by the FAA are there to help minimize the potential for potential FAA violations. So the use of this advisory circular, it sets a bottom line of standards that federally obligated airports can reference as they build their minimum standards. The FAA district and regional offices can help review the standards that airports create upon request and help them and advise them on the appropriateness of the proposed standards based on their type of operation. So the policy making itself, imposing standards ensures a safe and efficient level of operation for aeronautical service providers to the public. The standards must be reasonable and not unjust or discriminatory, so every aeronautical operator that has to comply with these must be able to comply, and it can't single out one specific type of operation. In order to engage in providing services, aeronautical operators must comply with the minimum standards. So earlier it was stated that compliance is not mandatory. From the airports, they often set their own standards, usually that are more tailored to their own airport, not necessarily what directly comes from the FAA. However, aeronautical operators must comply with the standards set by the airport if they choose to operate at that airport. Once the airport has established minimum standards, they have to uniformly and objectively apply them to all aeronautical service providers at the airport, not necessarily singling out one particular type of operation. So developing minimum standards, Grant Assurance 22, Economic and Non-Discrimination, gives airports the right to develop just and non-discriminatory standards for the safe and efficient operation of an airport. Airport operators have the right to deny aeronautical service providers the opportunity to operate for reasons of safety and efficiency. If they do decide to deny them for safety reasons, they must have evidence to prove that they're not complying. Some of the things to consider, which we'll also get into later, some more factors, the airport size and predominant aeronautical operators shape the standards within the type of operations and the scale of operations at each airport. The sponsor's prerogative. After establishing the size of the airport and the operations characteristics of the airport, sponsors can refer to this list to ensure that they're properly considering standards to adopt. Applying standards to all providers of aeronautical services, impose conditions that ensure safe, efficient operation of airport accordance to the FAA rules, regulations, and guidelines. Ensuring standards are reasonable and not discriminatory or unjust, and they are also attainable and uniformly applied. They're also there to ensure that standards are relevant to the activity which they apply to, and they need to ensure that standards provide the opportunity for newcomers to also meet the standards. So here we go, the factors to consider. Each of the following is a major factor that plays into the formulation of policy. The biggest is the type of airport, small, medium, large. And then the next is the type of aeronautical activities that will be conducted. So anything from airline operations to a small general aviation airport that may be receiving federal funding that is, primarily an agricultural airport, say like crop dusting or things like that. Then you also need to consider how much space will be required for each type of aeronautical activity. What type of documentation will business applicants be required to present as evidence of financial stability and good credit? So obviously you don't want failing companies to come in and try to cut costs and cut corners, because that often leads to lapses in adherence to safety policies and guidelines. Other factors to consider: to what extent each type of aeronautical activity would be required to demonstrate the compliance with sanitation, health and safety codes. So you have to decide how strict your standards are going to be. The FAA and this advisory circular sets their own kind of minimum standards, but oftentimes airports will set standards much higher. And so you have to be able to gauge what level of compliance you're looking for from airlines and how strict you're going to set your standards depending on your type of operation. And then what requirements will be imposed regarding minimum insurance coverage. That also comes with different types of operations. So you may have airlines and that may have higher liabilities than other types of operations, say like cargo handling or a maintenance operation on the airfield. So also gauging the scales of operation and the different amounts of liability are important for airports to consider when developing this policy. Each minimum standard is relevant to the aeronautical activity for which it is to be applied. So you don't want to be, this kind of goes with each airport's going to have its own type of standards based on the type of operation. So you don't want to make standards that are unattainable for, say, airlines or for like an air or agricultural based aviation operations at a major hub airline. They're not going to be able to comply with with guidelines set forth for airlines at a large hub airport. So minimum standards apply by activity. There are exceptions to this, such as like flying clubs, maintenance operations, air ambulance, flight training. So there's a lot of, you see like flight training at a lot of bigger airports. They may not necessarily have to comply with all the minimum standards that, say, an airline does at the same airport. There are ways that the airport still can regulate these operators, and it usually they usually handle that kind of on a case-to-case basis through licensing or permitting process, which will then establish minimum guidelines for that specific operation. And that way there's a written agreement between the individual operator and the airport, so they understand what they need to comply with. Through the fence operator is similar to individual operators. However, they are usually corporations and sometimes non-aeronautical entities that operate adjacent to or have some kind of access to airport grounds. So this is also handled on a case-by-case basis, and a written agreement is necessary that has to outline the specific access, access rights, payment provisions, and then compensation for the airport. There's also expiration dates for when they need to renew this type of agreement, and then default or termination provisions, insurance, and then also insurance provisions for each through the fence operator, depending on what type of operations. They're all going to be different depending on the type of business that's adjacent to the airport or has access to the airport. Some other requirements. When drafting the policy, adherence to the FAA is paramount. There are also other agencies affected. The Transportation Safety Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency also have requirements and minimum standards. So you want to make sure that not only are your minimum standards complying or within the window of FAA compliance, they're also within the window of TSA and EPA standards. So also for specific examples of policy modeling, you can see Section 2 of this advisory circular, where there are particular questions that airports may ask themselves based on the main type of operation at their airport. So in conclusion, minimum standards are developed by the airport to ensure the safety and efficiency of aeronautical operations. Airports should work with the FAA district office to review policies and make sure they're applicable to airport operations. And airports can always reference this advisory circular to help construct policies and make sure that they're the most applicable to their airport specific operations.